So today's topic of reporting of analysis is probably the fluffiest of topics because it does cover a lot. And reporting and analysis is, of course, an area that is all over the place. And reporting requirements is usually the area where we see most special requirements as well. Everybody has their own reports that they've done for years and they still want to do them the same way. And we have to find some ways to do that. I'll say on an overall topic that what we see in reporting has changed over the years. And I think that goes for BC in general, and of course also for project management, that BC comes with a lot of standard reports. Advanced projects comes with a lot of standard reports, and we're seeing less and less use of those standard reports because people want something that is interactive. They want something in Excel that they can move around and analyze and switch around and do their stuff, or they want to aggregate in different ways. So we're seeing less and less use of these built-in reports that is supposed to be printed on a standard sheet of paper, and you pull it out of the printer, you look at it, you take your marker pen and you highlight whatever you need to do, or you even put them in a binder and archive them. I mean, we're just not seeing that much use of those reports anymore, which of course is a shame because we have a lot of those reports and they're good to look at examples, but in real life, they're not that much used. What we see is people want either pages they can interact with or something being pulled into Excel or Power BI or somewhere else. And the documents are more left to a role of something that's for printed or PDF documents, invoices, etc. And that is a challenge to manage because it's much easier in some regard to do a fixed report that is part of the product than some kind of flexible solution to do reporting on. On the other hand, of course, that also puts a lot more responsibility on the partner and provides some opportunities to provide some additional services related to reporting. I think on the topic here, we have some things that are more to the data side of things, like managing entries and dimensions. And then we have listed a number of analysis views that we have created that might or not be relevant, but I also mentioned some of the reporting, but I'll not go into all of the standard reporting. Then, of course, we'll have a look at the Power BI reporting. Let me share a screen. Of course, everything starts with having the right data. I can say the first topics of today is not really about reporting. It's more management, but we put it in here just as well. So one of the things we see is time is reported or expenses are tracked, and then you realize they ended up in the wrong place, making it hard to consolidate your reporting or your numbers get wrong. And so not really related to reporting, but there are some possibilities to do corrections after the fact. We didn't look at corrections when we looked at invoicing, but there we rely on the standard processes of BC. So of course, just as you can invoice, you can also create credit memos out of those invoices, and it will handle that as well. So it's not a Progressive specific topic, but what if you happen to realize that something is wrong before you invoice? So if I take a project like this and see, I have a lot of project ledger entries in here, and I realized that this entry of resource Cassie having a client meeting on the 5th of December, that was the wrong project. She had that meeting as part of the demo 1 project instead. She just happened to put it on the wrong one. I mean, that happens, or the wrong task, or something else was wrong. There's no correction option for project ledger entries like what you can do with GL entries in some regards. I mean, for GL entry, you can do it if it's posted from a journal. Now, these entries are not posted from journals anyway, not necessarily, but we have a move entries button where you can select one or more entries. Let's actually go ahead and select both of these. So she said she had meeting both on the 5th and the 6th. I know this is the wrong project. And so I can say, no, I know this was on the demo 1 project. The task was right. So I'll put in that they go to the same task. And so you have to select both project and task if you move them. Then I can select if I want to have an audit trail of this. If I don't select this, it'll simply go in and modify the project ledger entries. And that's the easy way. We simply just switch it over and say, now there's a new project on it, but we might want to see what was the history of this. It was on one project at one point in time, and then in another point of time, it was somewhere else. And of course, the posting date makes a difference here, because if I move it with audit trail, I'll get new entries. I might not be able to create these entries back in 2029. That period is closed quite some time ago. I still haven't invoiced for them. but it's sitting in WIP waiting for me to invoice. And now I realize we couldn't invoice it because it was for another project. And so I could say, no, new posting date is today. I can also say, do I want to update the dimensions? I might want to grab the new dimensions from a new project and task. That might be more relevant than what was there. Or maybe for some reason I want to keep the original. Do I want to update the cost and prices? If there are special costs associated with that new project, new prices, we might want to update them. In this case, probably doesn't matter, but that's an option to do so. And so I can move them. And because I move them with audit trail, it'll create a negative entry on the original project, and it will create a positive on the other. So if I put in a filter here on client meetings, we will see that we now have 4 entries, and we should have them in here, where we see there was 1 and there was 7 hours, and now there's -1 hour and -7 hours. So we closed out the original entries by new entries, and we can see the new entries on this date. So if we analyze the data for 2019, we will see we have this, but if we look as of the current date, there is no usage of this because this one closes this one closes this one. And so the date, of course, makes a difference at what period of time we're looking at. It also means that by putting it into now, this doesn't change my historical reports. If I look at that, my report for 2019 still said that we did have usage back then, but then later on we moved it. And if I go to my new projects, I will see that I have my project ledger entries, and I should have the new ones for Cassie for the client meeting. So that's a move entries functionality. So this, we see these two, they came in here. No, any kind of entry. So that doesn't get reposted. It only moves the project ledger entry. I think that the story here is that it works well for time because that's usually not posted to GL. Expenses, I think it depends because usually expenses do not change price or cost. I mean, they cost what they cost and they're recharged at whatever they're recharged at. So the price and cost doesn't matter. The question is, would you need GL to be reclassified again to other dimensions? If you do need that, then I would probably go for creating a project journal with a negative and a positive entry for those lines again, because then you do the whole thing. But no, by default, we don't do additional entries for those. Most of the time where we see this used is, of course, for correcting errors where it's relevant for the project, but most of the time it's because it's probably the right customer and it might be the right place. It's just it was a wrong task. It doesn't really matter from a dimension perspective. It's mostly relevant to invoicing the customer. The customer will complain if it's on the wrong project when we send out the invoice, if it is a T&M invoice. But yes, there is a gap. If you really want to move the original cost of it as well, then you would need a new journal entry. And it becomes even more complicated if you have items on them, because what happens with the items, you took them out of inventory. And if I'm now going to move that, what does that even mean? Correcting those. I mean, correcting item ledgers is a mess. I mean, there are a lot of reclassification journals, etc. there, but it comes with its whole own set of trickiness, I would say. It's easy to use, but it also has its limitations. If the project is closed or if it's blocked, then you cannot do it. Then you would have to reopen it. This brought up the question of dimensions as well. And so there's a dimension related feature. I think I mentioned it early on when we talked about project setup, but there is this feature where you can define a project dimension, or here's called a job dimension, where you can say, we will use global dimension 1 as a project dimension. You have to turn it on as well. And if I do this, then every time I create a new project, then it will create a dimension value for the dimension that happens to be the global dimension 1, where the value of that will be the project number and the description will be the description from the project. And if I update that later on, it'll also update the dimension value, etc. And of course, it'll assign it to the project as well. In some implementations, this can be quite helpful. We see a lot of customers who like to have a project dimension code. So back to reports. There's a lot of reports in here. I won't go through all of them, but these are all the old school, printed out, laid out as paper kind of reports, or at least most of the ones that are in here are that kind of, if we do a profit summary, task summary, a labor summary, revenue summary, this is traditional reporting. But we start to do some reporting where we are using more analysis view like things like you could see in a timesheet status analysis to see how many hours have people reported or submitted on their timesheets in a given week. And here we see it's absolutely nothing. And so we could see if we go back a little bit in time, maybe we can get to a point where there is something. Yes, we can see here Prakash submitted 30 hours and how much of that was approved. If that's what we want to look at, then we can see here, week 9, he submitted 20 hours and his capacity was 20 hours. So he did the perfect timesheet for that 1 week. Everything else here looked really bad for everybody else. But this kind of reporting we see more and more use of because people can view it themselves and it's interactive. It's not just a piece of paper. And that's a bunch of these in here. I think the resource area is one of those where there are more functionalities, also things like usage analysis. If using the resource planning, you can see how much time do you have planned for a period of time. David here, 72 hours planned in April. That is not fully what he's expected. I mean, he has a full work month, so 72 hours, that's too little. That's why it's red. These kinds of analysis views. But I'd rather than we go through everything. If you have some requirements, there is a bunch of different ones. But I will say, have a look at some of these that are in the menus. They give a good starting point. I'll say for time tracking, these last ones and this one, generally, we see a lot of use for. Project reports, this is harder. Some like this one, the project forecast analysis, which looks at a certain point in time. So let's say at the end of March, for instance, we take that as a cutoff point. We do a filter on which project we want to look at. Then we get a list of the projects we have. We can even drill down into the subtask, but let's keep it at the level here. And then it sums up how much time. This is only for time, doesn't cover anything about expenses or items, but only for time, looking at how much time did we budget for and how much time have we spent so far, how much time have we scheduled for the future, not what is past in the past, but in the future, and looking at our schedule for the future plus what we did use in the past. So 203 we did use. We've scheduled 10 hours of future use. That ends up at 213. Our total budget for this was 203. So it looks like we're going 10 hours over budget on this one. And so it tries to make a reality check on saying we did something in the past, we plan to do something in the future. How does that hold up versus the budget? Because the budget might be at a different level of detail. So, but that requires you to use both budget and scheduling to give you some value here. And then of course you can see what the difference is in monetary amounts, depending on what the price of those are, if you try to price them out. Let's create an Anchor budget out of this as a duplicate. And of course, they are the same. But there is this report in here for budget comparison where you can say, I want to compare the initial estimate to the Anchor budget and have a look at that. Of course, you can set more filters, and then it will show you for each of the tasks, what was the budget on the initial estimate, what was the actual spend on it, what is the difference, so budget versus actual, and then the same for the other budget version. So we can see that, yes, everything looks good according to the current budget version, but if you compare against the initial budget version, then we're way over. What's important here is it doesn't actually compare the budgets. It just lists the output of the actual versus budget for two budget versions at the same time. But you could do a report that also looked at, I mean, it's just numbers, right? Differences between the two, maybe more for inspiration purposes. Then I will mention, and that has nothing to do with advanced projects, we are seeing more and more use of these new analysis views. You can do some really clever stuff. Don't forget about them. Unfortunately, we have no way of so far predefining them in the app. I'm hoping that comes at some point, but just the fact you can take project ledger entries. Oh, and please don't try to do it across everything. It seems like, especially if you have something like the project ledger entries, a lot of the values in here are computed values based on the detail ledger entries. And it seems like the second you press the analyze button, it will retrieve all the entries that you have available in that list, even if you don't see them. I mean, I saw only 25 lines, but there could potentially be 1,000, and that might be fine. But if I do it for the whole company and they have 1,000,000 entries, then it's like, ugh. But I mean, this is so powerful, and doing a pivot, I think you can get really far with these. I'm seeing this taking away the need for a number of reports that we did in the past. So I'm also a bit hesitant to do too much reporting in a number of areas. What I'm really hoping for is for a way for us to predefine a number of analysis views out of the box in the same way that we can do these predefined views that we see in some lists. I mean, we have some of these now. There are no special views, but you can do predefined views. It would be fantastic if we could do some predefined analysis out of the box. We might even go as far as creating some pages that are optimized for analysis. I think for project ledger entries, probably for performance. I mean, if you go for project ledger entries across everything, there are too many columns. That means it becomes a little bit slow if you use this analyze, but maybe we could cover some of these columns in a special page and say, maybe we don't need all the different variations of all the different things, but we'll see where that goes. I think this is really powerful. So there are two different Power BI reports out of the box. They are both some that you will have to request access for. And you will get that, of course. But if you go to the documentations, and I always search up here, it's easier, Power BI. So Power BI reports for advanced projects. You will see that there are two different reports. There's this one, which is the one that I was showing here. This is an older version of the same. But there is also an alternate one. And now I cannot click up here. I think there is also one here that looks slightly different, has slightly different numbers, different layout. You might want to try out both. And they're meant as a starting point. You can try them out. They come with some sample data, so you don't even have to connect them to anything. Then you can play around and see if they make sense. But I think it's also important to say that they are a starting point. There's something to begin with. Maybe the customer have some expertise themselves. Maybe you have somebody who can start here, and it gives you a data model to begin with. And surely they'll find that, oh, we need a little bit more, and you will have to add to the APIs and you will have to add to the data model, but you're not starting from zero. And I think that's the important part. There's some setup to be done as described here with how to put that in and then make that work. I would say this is the page to go to, because it's also here that you have to click this link to access a request form. You have to fill that in. The US team has to approve you to download it. So you get two different reports. There is the dashboard and there is the quick one, and then the README file with some descriptions of how to get started. So this is a place to start. And then again, I'll say what we see when it comes to data for some of these reports, we get asked relatively often, could we have an API for X table in the standard product as well? Could we have an API for this table? Because we need something in that area. And it always comes down to a question saying, yes, we could do that. What fields would you need to have? And they say, well, we would need these fields. And like, well, some of those fields, those are the custom fields that you had added. And so we cannot add them. Oh, okay, good. But could you create the base version? Then we can extend it. But the thing is, you cannot extend APIs. You have to create a new one every time there's a new field. So it's actually no use that you create one out of the box, because we have to create our own anyway. And so it's a bit of an unfortunate case of these APIs used for reporting, that on the surface, it seems like we're not really helping here because we are not providing APIs for everything. But in reality, it's because every time we do provide an API for something, people always come back and say, hey, could you help us extend it? And it's like, well, you cannot extend an API. That's the way BC works. That's the model, unfortunately. On the other hand, if you have a knowledgeable developer, it is really fast to create these APIs. There are even some guided experiences